What if I told you that one of the most influential architects of the 21st century, a woman who bent steel and concrete into fluid sculptures that seemed to defy gravity and physics itself, spent the first 15 years of her career being told her visions were unbuildable, impossible, too radical, and that she should just give up and do something more conventional, only to eventually transform the entire architectural landscape and prove that buildings could move, flow, and dance in ways the world had never seen before? Welcome to UrbArchitect, where today we're diving into the extraordinary life and work of Dame Zaha Hadid, the Iraqi-British architect who shattered every ceiling she encountered, literally and figuratively, who turned architecture into a dynamic exploration of space, movement, and fluidity, and who left behind a legacy of built works and visionary projects that continue to inspire, provoke, and challenge our understanding of what architecture can be in the contemporary world. Zaha Hadid was born on October 31, 1950, in Baghdad, Iraq, into a progressive cosmopolitan family during a period when Baghdad was experiencing significant modernization and economic growth due to oil revenues. In this context of a rapidly developing Middle Eastern city, with ambitious modern architecture projects would profoundly influence her understanding of what architecture could achieve and how it could transform societies. Her father, Mohammed Hadid, was a wealthy industrialist and co-founder of the National Democratic Party in Iraq, a progressive political movement, and her mother, Wajaha al-Sabanji, was an artist, and both parents valued education highly and encouraged their daughters' intellectual and creative development in ways that were relatively unusual for women in the Middle East at that time. Hadid attended Catholic schools in Baghdad run by French nuns, giving her a multilingual education and exposure to Western culture alongside her Iraqi heritage, and she has described how seeing Frank Lloyd Wright's designs for Baghdad, including a never-built opera house, sparked her interest in architecture as a child, showing her that buildings could be visionary and transformative rather than merely functional. In 1972, after briefly studying mathematics at the American University of Beirut, Hadid moved to London to study architecture at the Architectural Association School of Architecture, known simply as the AA, which was at that time arguably the most experimental and intellectually adventurous architecture school in the world, a place where radical thinking was encouraged, and where students were pushed to question every assumption about what architecture was and could be. At the AA, Hadid studied under Rem Koolhaas and Elia Zengelis, who were developing their theoretical ideas about urbanism and architecture that would later be published in Delirious, New York, and she became part of a brilliant cohort of students who would go on to become major figures in architecture, and under their mentorship she developed her distinctive approach to architectural drawing, creating explosive, dynamic compositions that showed buildings fragmenting, floating, and dissolving into their sites in ways that were more like abstract paintings than conventional architectural representations. Her thesis project, a hotel on the Hungerford Bridge in London, already showed the characteristics that would define her mature work: dynamic angular geometries, a sense of movement and flow, fragmentation and layering, and a complete rejection of the orthogonal boxes that dominated most contemporary architecture. And while the project was speculative and unbuildable with the technology of the mid-1970s, it demonstrated a unique architectural vision that was unlike anything her teachers or peers were producing. After graduating from the AA in 1977, Hadid worked briefly for Koolhaas's Office for Metropolitan Architecture before establishing her own practice, Zaha Hadid Architects, in London in 1979, but what followed was more than a decade of professional frustration and financial precarity during which she won numerous competitions, produced spectacular designs, taught at prestigious universities, and gained recognition in architectural circles, but struggled to get anything actually built because clients, engineers, and contractors kept telling her that her designs were too complex, too expensive, too radical, or simply impossible to construct. This period of paper architecture, where she was producing visionary unbuilt projects and exhibiting her drawings and paintings in galleries and museums, was crucial to developing her ideas and building her reputation, but it was also incredibly frustrating for an architect who desperately wanted to see her visions realized in three-dimensional space, rather than just on paper or canvas. Her competition entry for the Peak Leisure Club in Hong Kong in 1983 is a perfect example of her work from this period, a crystalline explosion of angular forms that seems to be erupting from the mountaintop site, with fragments flying outward in multiple directions, creating spaces that are dynamic, disorienting, and utterly unlike any building that existed at the time. And while the project was never built due to economic recession, and the developer's concern about its feasibility. The drawings and paintings Hadid produced for it are considered masterpieces of architectural representation and are in the collections of major museums including MoMA in New York. Throughout the 1980s, Hadid continued to enter competitions, continued to produce visionary projects, continued to teach including positions at Harvard, Yale, and the University of Applied Arts Vienna, and continued to refine her architectural language, but she was also becoming increasingly frustrated with the gap between her visions and the conservative reality of the architectural profession, and there were moments when she seriously considered giving up architecture altogether because the constant rejection and the inability to build was taking a severe emotional and financial toll. The breakthrough finally came in 1993 when her design for the Vitra fire station in Weil am Rhein, Germany, was completed, and this small building, essentially just a facility for the fire brigade serving the Vitra furniture campus designed by various notable architects, became Hadid's first realized work and immediately demonstrated that her radical formal language could be translated into actual built space. The fire station is a composition of sharp, intersecting concrete planes that seem to be frozen in motion, with walls that lean at dramatic angles, spaces that compress and expand, and a sense of dynamic energy that makes the building feel like it's about to launch into movement. And while the building is relatively small and has a simple program, it proved that Hadid's architecture wasn't just beautiful drawings but could be built, experienced, and inhabited, and it established her as a serious architect rather than just a visionary paper architect. Following the Vitra fire station, commissions began to come more regularly, though Hadid's practice remained relatively small and focused on cultural and institutional projects rather than commercial work, and each new building pushed the boundaries of what was formally and technically possible, developing and refining her distinctive architectural language. The Bergisel ski jump in Innsbruck, Austria, completed in 2002, is a soaring concrete structure that curves and twists as it rises, creating a sculptural form that's both functional sports infrastructure and architectural landmark. And the MAXXI Museum of 21st Century Art in Rome, completed in 2010 after a lengthy and complicated design and construction process, is perhaps her most sophisticated exploration of fluid, interconnected space, with curving walls and ramps that create a continuous spatial experience where you're never quite sure where one gallery ends and another begins, where the circulation becomes the exhibition space, and where the building itself becomes a work of art that embodies the contemporary, experimental nature of the art it houses. But it was probably the Heydar Aliyev Center in Baku, Azerbaijan, completed in 2012, that most fully realized Hadid's vision of fluid, continuous architectural form, with its sweeping curves that fold from the ground plane up to become walls and then roof in one seamless gesture, creating a building that appears to be a single continuous surface without any visible joints, corners, or breaks, like a piece of white fabric draped over the program and frozen in place. The building houses a museum, library, and conference facilities, but its significance is primarily formal and symbolic, demonstrating that buildings don't need to have orthogonal geometries, flat floors, and vertical walls, that architecture can be topographic and landscape-like, that interior and exterior can flow into each other, and that contemporary digital design and fabrication technologies can realize forms that would have been impossible to design or construct just a generation earlier. The Guangzhou Opera House in China, completed in 2010, is another masterwork that shows Hadid's approach to large-scale public buildings. With two massive boulder-like volumes containing the performance halls, their forms eroded and sculpted to create entrances, circulation spaces, and terraces, and their interiors lined with parametrically designed acoustic panels that serve both functional and aesthetic purposes, creating spaces that are simultaneously highly technical and poetically expressive. So what exactly was Zaha Hadid's architectural philosophy and approach, and how did she and her team actually design and construct these incredibly complex buildings? At the core of her work was a fascination with movement, fluidity, and dynamic space, influenced by Russian constructivism and suprematism, particularly the work of Kazimir Malevich, whose abstract paintings Hadid studied intensely, and whose floating, fragmented compositions directly influenced her architectural drawings and forms. She was interested in how architecture could capture and express movement even though buildings are static objects, how spaces could flow and connect in non-hierarchical ways rather than being organized in rigid sequences, and how the boundary between architecture and landscape, between interior and exterior, between floor, wall, and ceiling, could be dissolved to create more fluid and organic spatial experiences. Her design process typically began with painting and drawing, creating explosive, colorful compositions that explored spatial relationships, geometries, and movement in abstract terms before any specific programmatic or technical considerations were addressed. And these paintings weren't just presentation tools, but genuine research instruments where she was investigating formal and spatial ideas that would later be translated into architecture. As digital design tools became available in the 1990s and 2000s, Hadid's office became an early and sophisticated adopter of parametric design software, using tools like CATIA originally developed for aerospace engineering and automotive design, and later programs like Rhino and Grasshopper that allowed architects to create complex curved geometries, generate variations, and analyze structural and environmental performance in ways that would be impossible with traditional drawing methods. Her longtime associate and collaborator Patrick Schumacher, who eventually became the principal of Zaha Hadid Architects after her death, developed theoretical frameworks around parametricism, arguing that it represented a new architectural style for the 21st century based on complex curved geometries, continuous differentiation, and responsive form generation, though these theories have been controversial, and some critics argue they prioritize formal complexity over other architectural values, like sustainability, affordability, or social responsibility. The translation of Hadid's fluid sketches and parametric models into actual buildable structures required extraordinary collaboration with structural engineers, particularly firms like Arup and Adams Kara Taylor, who specialized in complex geometries and innovative structural systems, and these engineers had to develop new structural approaches including space frames, geogrids, and shell structures that could span large distances, while maintaining the curved forms without visible structural interruptions. The construction of Hadid's buildings also required sophisticated fabrication techniques, with many components being digitally fabricated using CNC milling, robotic cutting, or 3D printing, and with complex curved panels being manufactured to precise tolerances and then assembled on site like three-dimensional puzzles, a process that required detailed coordination between the digital models and the physical construction, and that pushed contractors and builders to develop new skills and methods. One of the recurring challenges in Hadid's work was cost, with many of her buildings running significantly over budget during construction due to the complexity of the forms, the custom fabrication required, and the difficulty of accurately estimating costs for unprecedented building types, and this led to criticism that her architecture was elitist, affordable only for wealthy institutions or authoritarian governments, and that it prioritized formal expression over practical concerns like budget, sustainability, or social impact. Hadid and her defenders would argue that innovation is always expensive, that pushing boundaries requires taking risks and accepting higher costs, and that over time as techniques become standardized and more widely adopted, costs come down, making what was once experimental eventually become normal, which is exactly what happened with many modern construction techniques that were initially expensive but became routine. The environmental performance of Hadid's buildings has also been debated, with critics pointing out that complex curved geometries often create thermal bridging, that large glazed areas in sculptural forms can lead to excessive solar gain, and that the emphasis on formal innovation sometimes came at the expense of environmental sustainability, though Hadid's office increasingly incorporated sustainable strategies in their later work, including natural ventilation, daylighting analysis, and renewable energy systems, and projects like the Galaxy Soho in Beijing or the Napoli-Afragola railway station demonstrate that fluid, dynamic architecture can also be environmentally responsive when sustainability is prioritized from the beginning of the design process. Zaha Hadid's impact on architecture extends far beyond her built works to include her role as a pioneering woman in a profession that has historically been dominated by men and that has often been actively hostile to women's advancement. When she started her career in the 1970s, there were very few prominent female architects, and throughout her career she faced discrimination, skepticism, and criticism that male architects with similar approaches did not encounter, with her personality being described as difficult or demanding, in ways that suggested gendered double standards where assertiveness and high expectations in men are seen as leadership, but in women are seen as problems. In 2004, Hadid became the first woman to receive the Pritzker Architecture Prize, often described as the Nobel Prize of Architecture, and while this was a historic achievement that brought attention to gender inequity in the profession, Hadid herself was often ambivalent about being celebrated primarily for her gender rather than for the quality of her work, saying in interviews that she wanted to be recognized as a great architect, not just as a great female architect. Her success opened doors for other women in architecture, demonstrating that it was possible to achieve the highest levels of recognition and to build major projects around the world despite the profession's structural barriers. And today there are significantly more prominent female architects than there were when Hadid started, though gender equity remains a significant challenge in architecture with persistent pay gaps, advancement barriers, and cultural biases that affect women throughout their careers. Hadid's influence on architectural education and on the broader culture of contemporary architecture has been profound, with her emphasis on digital design tools, parametric thinking, and formal experimentation becoming increasingly mainstream in architecture schools and practices around the world, and with her bold, sculptural approach inspiring countless younger architects to think more ambitiously about form and space, even if they don't directly imitate her specific aesthetic. Some critics have argued that Hadid's influence has been problematic, that the emphasis on spectacular form and digital complexity has led to a generation of architects more interested in creating Instagram-worthy sculptural objects than in addressing the genuine social, environmental, and economic challenges facing cities and communities, and that the Zaha effect has created pressure to produce increasingly dramatic and unusual forms, even when the program, budget, or context doesn't justify such formal gymnastics. These critiques raise important questions about architecture's priorities and values, about whether the profession should focus on innovation and formal expression or on sustainability and social equity, though it's worth noting that these aren't necessarily incompatible goals and that architecture can pursue multiple values simultaneously, and that Hadid's own work, while undoubtedly focused on formal innovation, also engaged seriously with programmatic complexity, urban context, and in her later years, environmental performance. When Zaha Hadid died suddenly from a heart attack in March 2016 at the age of 65 while being treated for bronchitis in a Miami hospital, the architectural world mourned the loss of one of its most visionary and influential figures, and there was genuine uncertainty about whether her practice, which had grown to employ over 400 people working on projects around the world, could continue without her singular vision and leadership. Patrick Schumacher, who had been her partner and collaborator for nearly 30 years, took over as principal, and the firm has continued to operate as Zaha Hadid Architects, completing projects that were in progress at the time of Hadid's death, including the Daxing International Airport in Beijing, one of the world's largest airport terminals with a stunning starfish-like plan and fluid interior spaces, and taking on new commissions that continue to develop the formal language and design approach that Hadid pioneered. The question of whether architecture firms can successfully continue after the death of their founding visionary is always interesting and complicated, with some practices like Frank Lloyd Wright's or Mies van der Rohe's essentially ending with their founders, while others like Foster Plus Partners or SOM have successfully transitioned to collective leadership, and Zaha Hadid Architects appears to be navigating this transition relatively successfully, though inevitably the work has evolved and the firm's identity has shifted somewhat without Hadid's personal charisma and creative intensity. Looking at Zaha Hadid's legacy today, nearly a decade after her death, what's most remarkable is how thoroughly she transformed the possibilities of architectural form, and how her vision of fluid, dynamic, sculptural architecture has moved from being radical and marginal to being one of the established approaches in contemporary practice. Buildings that would have seemed impossible or insane in the 1980s when Hadid was doing paper architecture are now being built regularly around the world, not necessarily in direct imitation of her style, but using the digital design tools, parametric thinking, and complex fabrication methods that her work helped pioneer and legitimize. She demonstrated that architecture didn't have to be orthogonal, that buildings could be continuous sculptural forms rather than assemblies of discrete elements, that the boundary between architecture and landscape could be eroded and reimagined, and that the experience of architectural space could be dynamic, disorienting, and emotionally powerful in ways that challenged modernist assumptions about clarity, rationality, and functional expression. Her work also engaged with fundamental questions about architecture's relationship with context, with some projects like MAXXI in Rome showing great sensitivity to site, history, and urban fabric even while being formally radical, and other projects being more autonomous sculptural objects that seem to have landed from another dimension regardless of their surroundings, and this variability has been both a strength, showing her range and adaptability, and a point of criticism for those who felt that her formal language was applied too uniformly regardless of context. As architects and students, we can learn from Zaha Hadid's career about the importance of persistence and conviction in pursuing a vision, even when the world isn't ready for it, about the potential of new technologies to enable new forms and experiences, about the complex relationship between innovation and practicality in architecture, about the challenges and opportunities of being a pioneering figure in a profession that hasn't always welcomed diversity, and about the ongoing tension between architecture as art and architecture as social service, between buildings as sculptural objects and buildings as responsive solutions to human needs and environmental constraints. Hadid's architecture demands engagement and provokes reaction. It's not neutral or background architecture, but rather insists on being noticed and experienced. And whether you love it or find it excessive, whether you see it as visionary or as self-indulgent, there's no question that it expanded what architecture could be and how it could function in the contemporary world. Her boldness, her refusal to compromise her vision, her technical innovation, and her sheer creative energy transformed the architectural landscape and inspired countless architects to think more ambitiously about what buildings could become. If you found this exploration of Zaha Hadid's life and work insightful, and you want to continue learning about the architects, buildings, and ideas that are shaping our built environment, make sure you're subscribed to UrbArchitect and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into architectural history and theory. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think about Zaha Hadid's legacy. Do you see her work as visionary